Yeah, so
Okay.
you either shouldn't have them or they should be dragged in by the others, right?
Mm,
So, what happens is, as your nucleus gets stronger, people get pulled closer and closer to them, right? So, people are inspired by other people, generally speaking, right? So if there's people
mhm,
that are success and they create a strong environment, somebody on the outside says, well, I'd rather be with them than this guy over here, right? So they move closer
mhm,
to the center, and the less variance you have on performance, the stronger your team is, and that goes to, I teach floor and ceiling performance, right? And what you
mhm.
want is you want to continue to raise the ceiling. So hey, we're always getting better and we're always looking to push the ceiling. And what you want to do is raise the floor as well, so that your distance between your ceiling and your floor becomes narrower, right? So there's less variance.
Mm-hmm.
On your bad days, they're not really that bad.
Welcome to Career Coaching Secrets, the podcast where we talk with successful career coaches on how they built their success and the hard lessons they learned along the way. My name is Davis Wynn, and I'm the founder of Purple Circle, where we help career coaches scale their business to $100,000 years, $100,000 months, and even $100,000 weeks. Before Purple Circle, I've grown several 7- and 8-figure career coaching businesses myself, and have been a consultant at 2 career coaching businesses that are doing over $100 million each. Whether you're an established coach or building your practice for the first time, you'll discover the secrets to elevating your coaching business.
Welcome to Career Coaching Secrets Podcast. I'm Pedro, and today's guest is George Dupont, founder of George Dupont Leadership. He's a former pro hockey captain who learned leadership where pressure is real and results are public. After years competing at the highest levels and later leading complex turnarounds as a senior operator, he's built a career helping CEOs and senior teams perform when the stakes rise. So today he installs pressure-proof operating systems that sharpen decision-making, strengthen culture, and create alignment that holds under stress, driving measurable gains in revenue, execution, and team performance. His playbook turns live experience into simple, teachable systems leaders can rely on. Welcome to the show, George.
Thank you for having me, Pedro.
Likewise, I'm very excited you're here with us. Yeah, and we're going to talk about the hockey experience for sure, right? So
Okay.
that's fun. And I like to rewind a bit. Every coach has that moment where they look at their life and say, yeah, I guess this is what I'm doing now. So the origin story, when was that for you?
Being a hockey player my whole life, I was fortunate enough to be on a lot of good teams, and I was fortunate enough to be a captain of a lot of those teams, right? And a lot of times the captain is kind of just picked, right? Not necessarily because he's a great leader, but more often than not because he's one of the better players. And I was lucky enough to have good people around me, and realized that if we wanted to be a good team, you had to lead by example. So that was the very first lesson I learned about leadership. And then eventually it just seemed like the next step in my career at some point would be coaching, right? I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know how or where or when, but I knew that would be the next step, logical step, because I had a passion for it, right? I had a passion for performance, I had a passion for improvement, I had a passion for development, and I wanted to be able to put that passion to use. And so I knew that the next step ultimately at some point would be coaching.
It's interesting that it was almost like it was a natural evolution. It's something that just naturally organically happened, right? You're in the hockey team, then you're a captain, and then you venture yourself into the business world, and now you're a coach, right? It
Yeah,
sounds like
yeah, I actually went from playing to coaching right away. So I went from playing to coaching professional hockey right away. And it was a difficult experience having to go from playing to now coaching people that the year before with you were playing, right? So I was a head coach of a minor professional hockey team in
mhm.
Tupelo, Mississippi. And I was now recruiting and coaching people that were only a couple years younger than I am, some were near the same age, and now you're coaching them,
Mm,
right? So, there's a lot of growth in that first experience as far as just learning how to separate yourself from being a member of the team to now being the leader slash coach of the team, right? Now, I
mhm.
always feel it's a better example to say people work with you than for you. But there's still a separation that needs to happen from being the coach slash leader from being a captain per se, right? Now you're all kind of rowing in the same direction, but there's a little bit of separation. So it was a unique experience coming out and getting right into coaching. And I did that for a number of years, and chasing the dream in minor professional hockey was a little hectic, right? Our team folded because we weren't doing well financially. And that happens a lot in minor professional sports. So eventually we decided, okay, we'll settle down. I'll get into the corporate world. And, once I made my way into the corporate world, it just seemed to be a natural progression again to take on a leadership role and coach other executives and members of our team.
Okay. That's interesting. And when did it shift from, at least on the business side, from I'm helping people to I'm building a real business around this? Whether I know you've been in corporate America. I know you went from player to captain, and then from employee to coach. I want to understand when that shift happened towards the coaching space.
Well, I think I mentioned earlier that it was always a passion to kind of, bring up the people around me so that together we could accomplish better things, right? And I always recognized that you were only as strong as every team member was, right? The best teammates were ones that did their job to the best of their ability, and the ones that kind of challenged and held each other accountable. And when I got into the business world, I happened to initially take over an area, a region in our company that was underperforming, and that was, recognized within the company as a misaligned region with a lot of chaos and a lot of people that weren't they were all going in their own direction. And when I was hired, I was tasked specifically with, hey, can we turn this region around? And I remember one person saying, well, hey, you're going to have to change a lot of the people on the team if you're going to have a turnaround. So start evaluating and look at who you have to eliminate. And before I ever think about eliminating somebody, I always try and think about what can I do to empower them and give them all the tools they need to be successful within the team. And through a lot of conversation and through a lot of kind of working through some issues, I was able to discover that a lot of the problems weren't with the individuals. It was a misalignment from the leadership and the culture that they had created within that region. And I'm a firm believer, and this was really the start of it, where I really believe leadership and culture is a performance multiplier. That talent sets the floor, and that leadership and culture set the ceiling. So I spent a lot of time working with the people within the region to understand what the barriers were that were stopping them from being successful, and then trying to provide them with the tools and the understanding of the things that they needed. And over time, and relatively quickly, we went from an underperforming, misaligned region with chaos to a region that was functioning at the highest end of the company. And I gave a lot of that credit to the new culture that we created within the area of openness, empowerment, conversation, and that was really kind of the start of a little bit of my leadership philosophy.
One thing that's very interesting. One thing that caught my attention based on your experience is that we see a lot of people not thinking twice about getting, I don't know, a soccer coach, a hockey coach, but sometimes we see that in business owners. Hey, I know how to run my business, right? They have this, I'm not saying everyone is like that, but have you seen this, I would say, noise to get a business coach, but not so much in the sports environment? Do you see that friction, or am I tripping here?
Well, I actually feel that for whatever reason, there's some resistance to getting a business coach, right? And if you look at any high performing individual, most of them have some kind of coach that they've assigned, right? Like, so in professional sports, right? It went from, I'm an athlete, I do my training, I have my coach that helps me out. Then it went to, okay, I now have a physical coach that helps me train, right? Now I have a mindset coach that helps me think. I have a nutritionist that helps me, stay fit. And they look at all these different things that provide an edge that lead to peak performance. And, one of the biggest challenges leaders have is awareness and understanding, right? And I think awareness and understanding are absolutely non-negotiables. They're something that you have to be able to lead. And the one thing about a coach is that they can help provide some of that awareness and understanding. and they can provide simple principles or simple philosophies or insights that allow you to think through some of your decision-making patterns, some of the way that you manage people, some of the way that you manage leadership. And, having a coach isn't a sign of weakness. As a matter of fact, I think it's a sign of strength to be able to recognize that, hey, you know what, I want somebody because I want to be the best I can be. I want somebody. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to find a leadership coach that and say 100% of what he says I've got to do, right? Because I think the benefit of having a coach is being able to work together and find areas where you need improvement and areas where you say, hey, you know what, I hear what you're saying, but I do think in my situation, this works best, right? Because the challenge is actually giving it thought, and being able to provide insight so that builds the awareness, then it builds the understanding, and then, and then hopefully leads to action, right? And the fact that you've now had somebody who says, okay, I wasn't aware of that. Now that I am, I understand what I need to do. And I think that coaching is critical. I went through a lot of different, company built coaching platforms, right? We went through Myers-Briggs, Colors, DISC, all these ones that provide assessments and say, well, as a leader, you need to learn that Pedro is a blue green and you're a green yellow, and there's a communication gap between the two of you. And I do think that awareness is important, but I do believe that there's things that go beyond that leaders need to understand, not only about themselves but about leadership, right? And first it's lead by example, and then there's a number of different things that fall into lead by example, and then it's then it's your influence, which is relational leadership, and then it's impact, right, which is your impact on performance. And there's certain things that fall in there that, from a leadership standpoint, that are non-negotiable. You can't tell somebody to show up on time if you're always late. You can't tell somebody, that here's a deadline if you're always missing deadlines, right? So, there's things that you have to have when it comes to lead by example, or else your team loses faith in you, or at the very least, loses some belief or optimism in outcome, right? And optimism and outcome are essential to teams playing at their peak performance.
That's interesting. Okay. So after you got rolling, who are the people that kept showing up? The ones you realized, okay, these are my people? Because at the early days, I know coaches struggle a lot with that. They're trying to get the entire world, right? So were you able to pinpoint exactly who are your people?
Well, so I developed something called the alignment operating system. So what the alignment operating system does is it says, okay, what's the culture that we're trying to create? What's our mission? What's our vision? So you become very clear about that. And then what you're doing is you're defining people based on their alignment to the culture. And you have your core contributors when it comes to your culture and your mission and your vision. And then you have people that are core, but maybe they're not as vocal. Maybe they don't hold others accountable, but they certainly carry themselves the way that you wish. Then you have some people that kind of can go either way, and then you have the people that are on the outside that everything's a challenge. Everything is, they're misaligned with everything. They recognize problems before they find solutions. They do all these other things, right? And what most people do is, they have this group of people. What you're trying to do is bring people towards the middle, closer to your core values. And people lose sight based on talent. Somebody's talented, but they're misaligned. You're better off to have somebody who's aligned and maybe a little bit less talented. And what you're trying to do is give yourself some insight on where people fall within that circle. And the closer they are to the middle, the stronger your team is, and ultimately the better performance you're going to have. And so what you're trying to do is recognize the people based on their commitment to culture and their commitment to the company's vision and mission, and see the big picture. And you're trying to empower them and have them pull people together and hold others accountable, right? So that it becomes a system that ultimately, people follow, strong leaders, and you're trying to create a strong nucleus. And what happens is you limit the chaos, you limit the noise, you limit the misalignment. And ultimately, if people don't become pulled in, then they don't belong on the team, right? So where most people make the mistake is, they get somebody who has, maybe a little less character, a little less aligned, but great talent, and they want to hang on to that person, right? Person is actually, taking away from the whole a little bit more, right? So what I try and do is give people a vision of where their people land on in that circle, so they have an understanding of what kind of performance their team is going to have based off of where people are falling. And there's assessments that help with that, but there's also, in your heart, in your heart whether Pedro is Pedro a guy that understands the company mission, understands the vision, holds people accountable, holds himself accountable, takes ownership. And if he is, then we need Pedro on our team, because Pedro is going to get the guy next to him to follow and do the same thing. And so that teaches you as a leader where to put your energy, right? So too many people spend their energy on the misaligned when their energy actually needs to be focused on the people who are aligned with what the company mission and vision is.
Right. It's not about the right or I'm sorry, not about the good or the bad apple. It's about the right apple, right? That fits the culture
Yes.
you're trying to implement. Okay.
Yeah, and
Okay.
you're trying to allow that good apple to have some impact and empower them, right? So you're trying to allow that person, because you don't need policies and procedures for the right people. Policies and procedures are generally put in place to manage the 20% that are misaligned, right? So if you're the right person, you're going to try and do what's right for the company. So I need to empower you to have an impact on the company. So I'm trying to empower you. I'm trying to allow you the freedom to be able to make decisions, to be able to have an impact on the company going in the right direction. And that's where my time and energy should be spent, on people who are going to actually drive performance, drive impact, and try and create an environment that's a winning or championship environment. And then, because too many leaders get caught up in trying to manage the misaligned. So I spend 80% of my time on the misaligned people. And what happens is the people that are truly passionate about the company and truly passionate about having an impact feel a little left out. And as a result, you don't get 100% of their effort. You get good effort, but you don't get 100%, or you don't get as much impact from them as you possibly can. So my suggestion is to people is to manage, to understand who's in that nucleus, and try and bring people closer and closer to that nucleus by empowering more and more people. And by doing that, ultimately your performance rises.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned, because the 80% rule about the misaligned is because my father was a teacher at a university, and he always remembered the bad apples, right? The bad students, because the good, they just went by and had success. He never remembered their names. So that's funny you mentioned, right?
Yes.
It's exactly like that. You have a bad team, you're focusing on the guys that are not producing. You're focused, oh my God, how can I make X and Y and Z produce? But at the same time, that's almost you're almost shooting yourself in the foot, because you shouldn't have them in the first place, or they are misaligned with the company culture, right?
Yeah, so you either shouldn't have them, or they should be dragged in by the others, right? So what happens is, as your nucleus gets stronger, people get pulled closer and closer to them, right? So people are inspired by other people, generally speaking, right? So if there's people that are success and they create a strong environment, somebody on the outside says, well, I'd rather be with them than this guy over here, right? So they move closer to the center. And the less variance you have on performance, the stronger your team is. And that goes to, I teach floor and ceiling performance, right? And what you want to continue to raise the ceiling. So, hey, we're always getting better, and we're always looking to push the ceiling. And what you want to do is raise the floor as well, so that your distance between your ceiling and your floor becomes narrower, right? So there's less variance. On your bad days, they're not really that bad, right? And often when you get misaligned teams, you get chaos. You might have a great day and think everything's fine, but then tomorrow you might bottom out and it's like chaos all over, and you're putting out fires, right? And the closer you bring that floor and ceiling, the less chaos you have to deal with, the more you can concentrate on continuing to raise that ceiling. So that's why I look at trying to teach leaders where to spend their time and how to manage people, and manage the right people. If you're spending most of your time managing the wrong people, one is they're harder to get to the point where you're bringing them into the mix. And when you have the mix, your mix isn't as strong anymore, because, as somebody who wants to lead a team, you also want to feel appreciated. Right? Like, I mean, if you're leading a team, you want your coach or your manager or your leader to say, hey, Pedro, great job. right? Keep it up. Here's
Mm-hmm.
what I love about what you're doing. And hey, you know what? Hey, can you also help with this? And the
Mm-hmm.
good people and the passionate people are looking for more responsibility. They want to be empowered, and they're looking for, not necessarily recognition as far as putting them up on a pedestal, but at least some kind of,
Mm-hmm.
hey, my manager or my coach or my leader is noticing what I'm doing, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you feel appreciated.
Okay. I mean, that's the coaching side. Now let's talk about the part nobody escapes, right?
Okay.
Marketing. So how do people usually find you?
So I spent a lot of time on LinkedIn,
Mm.
trying to build a profile on LinkedIn and reach out. So, but I do find LinkedIn a very time consuming way to try and meet people. Right now, I do
Mm.
think through articles, I'll get some people that, hey, like the article, want to reach out and have a conversation. Hey, I'd like to learn more, and I'm happy to share. And then really, I'm starting to do a little bit more speaking engagements, podcasts, get up in front of people. And
Mm-hmm.
generally what I'll find is, that if my message resonates with somebody sitting there and they go, you know what, I hear what he's saying, and I'd like to learn more, or hey, I recognize that's happening to me and I'd like to learn more. I
Mm-hmm.
do find that that's the best way to get warm leads and people who have some understanding of what it is that I'm trying to do or trying to deliver, right? So I think that the warmer the lead, the better. And so I'm doing a little bit more, making myself visible, reaching out to people to speak at Chamber of Commerce events, business events, leadership events, and
Mm-hmm.
and then somebody in the audience, fail none, comes up and says, "Hey, I want to talk to you about my company or myself or where I'm at within our team, right? And do you mind
Mm-hmm.
putting aside 30 minutes to have a chat next week?" So that's generally what's working for me, and I like it. And like I
Mm-hmm.
said, I don't mind LinkedIn. I do think it's a good platform, but I do think there's a lot more cold outreach that goes along there, and trying to do a little bit more selling yourself from a cold standpoint rather than a little bit of a
Mm.
warm standpoint.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the speaking engagements, LinkedIn, which sounds like a good place. All right. So I want to talk business for a second,
Okay.
So people find you, they resonate with your work, and eventually they want to know what working with you actually looks like, right? So everyone builds their coaching business a bit differently. So when someone actually becomes a client, what does that experience look like right now? Is it one-on-one coaching, group coaching? How do you structure that?
So, I mean, a little bit of it depends on who and why, right? So, if
Mm-hmm.
it's an individual, we'll discuss what the goals are of the engagement, right, to make sure we're aligned, right? Okay, so if somebody comes to me and says, "George, I heard you speak. I want to, engage you and kind of go through it." So, let's say we decide to work together. We're on the same page. We're looking at trying to give the person some leadership guidance on how to manage his team. Start with an assessment, then I do an evaluation, I do interviews, and then I sit down. I build out a plan that says, okay, here's here are your strengths, here are areas that you might need to improve on, right? And then we go through and we
Mm-hmm.
identify them into, again, self leadership, so identity, and then relational leadership, which is influence, and then impact, right? And we go through and we put this all together. And like I said, I have what I call the dynasty DNA operating system, which says, hey, if you want to become a dynasty and you want to lead a dynasty and create a championship team, here are the things, and
Mm-hmm.
they fall under the 12 non-negotiables of championship leadership, which are divided into influence, impact, and identity, right? And then we work on where are the leadership gaps that you have, and let's try and understand why you have these leadership gaps and what can we do to improve them. And so it's all about, again, building awareness and understanding, and then working through the things that will help improve them. And then the other thing is that if it's an individual, it's also being honest with your team, right? Saying something
Mm-hmm.
like, hey, you know what? Hey, I recognized, hey, maybe in the last year, hey, some of you might think that I don't do this or this well. Look at I've hired a coach, or hey, I'm trying to make steps towards that. So if I'm not doing it, please make me aware, right? And recognizing that openness to your team is essential to some of this, because perception lags reality. So you might say to me, Pedro, hey, George, let's work on this. And you could start today and you can be dedicated as you want. But depending on the amount of interactions you have with people in your team, they might not recognize that you've made changes. It could take 1 month, it could take 6 months, it could take a year, depending on how often you interact with them. So making people aware that you're trying to change, and this is what you're trying to become, and this is why, is also a good strategy. And then if I get hired because of company culture, we do an overall assessment of the company. We do an overall assessment of the leadership team. So it generally goes by, beyond more than just one leader. And we look at, okay, what are our gaps between what we say our culture is and how we're acting, right? Because, I was brought in a lot of times for business consulting, and I always found that it was people and leadership and culture, generally not business per se, right? So the easy thing is coming up with the strategy. The hard part is executing the plan, right? And so when you execute the plan, it usually comes down to people and the way that we communicate, right? So it's not a surprise that two companies that offer the exact same service or product, one's extremely successful and the other's not, and it has nothing to do with service or product, right? So why is there such a gap between the way one person's doing it and the other? And generally, it comes down to leadership, culture, and people, and so that's where we kind of turn around and start identifying that. And then look at the areas where we can kind of close that gap and make the proper adjustments and take the proper action.
Okay. So considering you're doing interviews, you're doing outreach, speaking engagements, in leadership conventions, I mean, your work seems pretty hands-on. How do you think about capacity so you don't stretch yourself too thin?
Well, so we are trying to scale through like CEO, support groups, kind of more or less, where basically if you're a CEO running a business, we try and get 8 to 10 together, keep them together. We're just starting this now as far as a capacity thing. We're because most CEOs, are going through the same things, or you might be one stage behind me, or I might be a stage or two ahead of you. So you can help guide each other through certain experiences, and then trying to do more workshops as far as, an event. So we're looking at trying to start with some events, and workshops where individuals who are either CEOs or senior executives can do, or somebody aspiring to be a senior executive can attend. And again, it goes through a little bit more of the philosophy of how you should think and manage your teams, right? And a lot of times it's easy, if conflict, I call conflict a catalyst, and I call it necessary. I think conflict is necessary to be a championship team. Conflict isn't the issue. It's how we manage conflict that's the issue, right? And most people avoid conflict, and most people don't have the courage to enter into difficult conversations and some of these other things. So we teach people, how to handle conflict constructively, how to have the courage to enter into conversations that'll be productive, that are necessary for the success of your team, and then try and give them tools for all this other stuff to give consideration on how they manage their team.
I like that. Especially the conflict is necessary for a championship team. That really resonates. That's really cool. I've never heard that, but yeah. Okay. One thing every coach wrestles with at some point, and you don't need to give hard numbers, okay? This is about structure.
Yeah.
It's pricing and how to package their work. So how do you think it about today, and were there any lessons along the way that shaped how you landed there?
So, at first I underpriced because I thought it was necessary to enter into the market. And then I landed on something that I think is fair on both sides based off of what I think the return on investment is for somebody else, right? So, if I said to you, hey, you know what, I'm going to help you create a culture, your turnover is reduced, your production becomes higher, as a result, your margins become better. What is that worth to you, right? And ultimately, I landed on what I think is a fair price in relationship to the impact that I have based off value, right? And what I also don't do, what I used to do, is I don't spread myself too thin anymore. And that's why I end up charging a little bit more for my service, so that I can dedicate the necessary time to the individuals and the groups and the organizations. So I don't do more than 3 clients a quarter. on a one-to-one basis, and I try and engage them for at least 90 days. Because at the end of 90 days, I think that I can at that point measure the impact that I'm having, whether it's through a reevaluation and an assessment of culture and mindset, whether it is starting to see a reduction in turnover or key members contributing a little bit more, or whether it's starting to see the margins become a little bit wider because people are doing more, for the company, right? And as a result, you don't need as many people. I used to talk to people all the time. Are we hiring because we truly need to hire? Or are we hiring because we're allowing people to be inefficient, right? And what happens is when you get into this kind of organization where there's no conflict, everything seems harmonious. Often we end up hiring too many people, because the minute something becomes challenging, instead of challenging the people to do more and find ways to become more efficient, and maybe even giving them more tools to become more efficient, we hire an extra body, right? So you teach people how to kind of work through that. And actually, if you do it right, what ends up happening is people are able to do more in less time. And they're more productive, they're more satisfied. There's all these different things. So, so I think it's important that I'm able to deliver on what I say. So I take less clients, but I charge more for it.
Okay.
So I charge a premium dollar, and I try and get 90-day, if I'm doing an individual client, I try and get a 90-day commitment.
Okay. That's interesting how you approach pricing structure. Now, especially with maxing at 3 per quarter, right?
Yeah.
So now I'm curious about where you're taking all this, right? Looking ahead, where do you see the business going? Are you thinking about scaling, hiring, or is there a next step you're excited about?
Well, so ultimately what I'd like to do is start onboarding, the vision is starting to onboard coaches that do what I do and take my system and say, like you have a lot of these, the 5 habits of highly effective people, they have a curriculum that they teach, right? I'd like to teach coaches the Dynasty DNA operating system, 12 non-negotiables of champion leadership, and the 3 pillars, right? Identity, influence, and impact, and have them go out and start teaching it, right? So that it can become scalable. We do workshops, and we are now looking at doing live events, right? So we're looking at trying to get a lot more people to do events, in order to scale and make a little bit more money, right? Now, 3 clients a quarter, if I was to max out, and, because the first quarter is the most intensive, right? Just because you put I think there's a lot more effort and stuff that has to go in to make the change, to manage change. And then after that, it's more of a consulting basis, right? So we're still on retainer and we consult. So as we go through it, I would take on 12 new clients. Now they might remain clients all the way through. If they decide, hey, we want retainer, we want to be able to make a phone call, schedule a one-on-one meeting, do some of these other things, we make ourselves available. We're not at capacity for that yet. But, when I make the commitment, it's more about, the intensive part of the front end load, right? The things that you have to actively be doing. If you want to, it's like habit creation, right? If you want to create a habit and you want to change something, you have to be very intentional about it, and you have to do it all the time. Or, if you make a misstep, you set yourself back, right? If you say, I want to change things, and you make a few missteps, people are like, well, hey, you said you wanted to change, but you haven't really. So we've got to be very intentional about it. So we follow up on a regular basis and make ourselves available to make it very intentional. And then, after it's been intentional, we've created a habit, then we're more just advisory. And our scalability would be, to get more coaches eventually, and then to create some of these groups, the CEO championship group, and then some other workshops and events is kind of the way that we're looking at moving forward and creating something a little bit bigger.
Yeah, that's exciting, especially the part that you're trying to, get someone like a junior coach so you can groom him into the position so he can take more of the ops, and that would free up your time so you can focus more in the business. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, whenever we're aiming toward the next chapter, there's always something we're refining in the present. What are you currently trying to improve or tighten up in your business right now?
So I follow a 1% rule, and I always had something that I called incremental improvements or trying to get better all the time in my mind. And then I listened to James Clear, and James Clear had Atomic Habits, which is 1%. And so I evolved that a little bit to, I'm always looking to be 1% better every day. And I'm always searching for that last 1%. And the last 1% never comes, right? Because you're always searching for that last 1%. And it's kind of unattainable because there's always room for growth, right? You never hit the ceiling. So we're always looking for ways to improve, whether it's client feedback, whether it's, analyzing an event. And I do think that as we kind of go through this, the one area again is kind of the scaling. How can we have more impact on more people? And that goes to some of these bigger groups or things that we're going to let people try and feed off each other, right? So we're trying to become facilitators where we facilitate constructive conversations that allow people to take insights. I read a book years ago that said your job as a leader is to not lose the message and how it was delivered, but to make sure you understand the message that the person is trying to deliver, right? Because people get emotional, they could be upset, they could be shy, they could be timid, but your job as a leader is to make sure you thoroughly understand the message that they're trying to give you. I don't remember the book. I don't remember exactly when I heard it, but I remember the message, right? And that message, I think, has made me 1% better. Because I've taken it and I'm like, okay, I got to make sure I understand the message. I'm not going to be offended by whether Pedro comes in here angry, screaming, upset, because there's got to be something that's making him feel that way. I need to understand what it is that's making him feel that way and what the message is. So, I continue to try and apply that 1% rule all the time. And so I look at these groups that we're trying to create, and the groups that we're trying to create are all about 1% better. So every time somebody comes to one of our groups, I want them to feel like I left with at least one thing that made me 1% better today than I was when I left the meeting, right? Like the worst thing you can do are have meetings where everybody feels like it's the same old stuff and nothing's going to get changed. Nothing's going to get accomplished. What you want people to do is walk away going, hey, I'm inspired by that. And I got a great message, and I'm going to go and start trying to imply that to my life or my business or my leadership.
I mean, that meeting could be an email, right?
Pardon me?
Like people say, like they joke around that that meeting could have been an email, right?
Yes. Yeah. and I mean, there's so many meetings that end up that way. I mean, I remember being a part of them, and finally, I was in a company, and this is the third or fourth meeting that we had, and we talked about the same thing we had 4 meetings ago, and things would be put on the agenda. So I finally pulled the vice president aside, and I said, I've sat in on 4 of these meetings now, and we're at the exact same point we were basically 3 months ago, right? And there's no action, there's no follow up, there's no. And I said I can see people when I look at the room, and I can look at people's faces. There's eye rolling. There's people just putting their hands down. They're not speaking up anymore. And when you get into a meeting like that, you're in trouble. So, our goal is to create a meeting where people feel like, hey, I'm inspired, and I'm going to apply one thing to my life, one thing to my job, one thing to my leadership, and that's going to improve me or my company or my team.
That's very interesting. I love that. And George, if someone is listening, wants to connect with you or follow your work, where can people find you and connect with you?
So I have a website, georgedupontleadership.com. So there's information on the website. There's also a contact form. You can go to LinkedIn, and I think it's just /George-Dupont on LinkedIn. And then I have an email that's george@georgedupontleadership.com.
Okay. Well, there were a few things you shared today that really stuck with me. I would say first, being, player to captain hockey team, right? And then going to corporate America and then going to coaching. It sounds very natural, and that you don't have not that you don't have, you do have that experience for more, I don't know, 20, 30 years. That's so cool. And it's, in a way, it's not that formal experience, but you've been there and done that, that nitty gritty part of coaching that I don't see most of coaches having, so I would pinpoint that. And also the fact that you mentioned that the coach not necessarily is always right. It's like
Yeah.
he will provide you a different lens into your business. So like you said, doesn't mean it's right, but that different perspective sometimes made you aware of something you haven't thought of, right? The client haven't thought
Yeah.
of it. Now, hey, wait, maybe this will really move the needle, and last is I even wrote a sentence. It's like conflict is necessary to be a championship team. So I really like that. It's
Yeah.
like, do not avoid conflict because it builds up, right? It doesn't go away.
No. And conflict's not bad. It's how people handle conflict that's bad, right?
Mm.
And so what you've got to do as a leader is teach people how to handle conflict. So conflict is just you and I having a difference of opinion, right? You're on one side, I'm on the other. We disagree. How we handle it is the important part, and that's where great leadership ends up having a huge impact, right? Like, so if you're on a team, if I enter a business and they say, "Oh, we never have arguments or disagreements," and hey, we love everybody here and it's harmonious. At the end of the day, when you get deep down into it and you get off into a water cooler conversation with somebody over on the side, they're like, "Yeah, it's good here, but," and they follow it up with a but, and then they come out with their problem, right? And they're either afraid to speak up, they don't want to rock the boat, but their opinion could have a huge impact on performance and probably needs to be discussed, even if it's going to upset somebody. And as a real good leader, you start to learn how to handle conflict, because conflict is necessary. If the goal is to get it right and not be right. So if I want to get it right, I don't have to be right. I want to get it right. So I want everybody to offer opinions and insights, and then the goal is to get it right. There's going to be conflict because not everybody's going to agree on that direction. But if everybody is motivated by getting it right and not being right, and you take a little bit of pride out of it, and you take, hey, our goal is to be the best team that we possibly can and the most successful team we possibly can, then you're going to try and find the right answers regardless, right? And you take personal stake out of it, and then you learn how to handle that conflict. I'm a huge believer that conflict is a catalyst and conflict is necessary for championship teams.
George, I appreciate what you do. Appreciate you being here today and sharing so openly. Okay. It was great having you.
Pedro, I appreciate you having me on the podcast.
That's it for this episode of Career Coaching Secrets. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this episode to catch future episodes. This podcast was brought to you by Purple Circle, where we help career coaches scale their business to $100,000 years, $100,000 months, or even $100,000 weeks, all without burning out and making sure that you're making the impact and having the life that you want. To learn more about our community and how we can help you, visit joinpurplecircle.com.